Yahoo News, 13th of November 2023, beneath public assurances, Xi Jinping advances pessimistic opinions about U.S. As part of its 100-year war plan against the United States, China has been launching an all-out war against the United States. During his maiden state visit to the U.S. in 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping couched his requests for deference in guarantees. He defended China's internet censorship while courting tech executives. Despite reiterating China's maritime claims in the disputed South China Sea, he denied that the country was militarizing the area. In an optimistic speech, he discussed a new model for excellent power relations in which Beijing and Washington would live harmoniously as equals. However, back home in China, Xi was issuing strong warnings in military talks, saying that the People's Liberation Army should be ready for a possible confrontation and that growing competition between a rising China and a long-dominant U.S. was all but inevitable. Subscribe to the New York Times' The Morning Newsletter. China, according to Xi, wanted to rise peacefully. Still, Western nations would not accept the possibility that China, under communist leadership, was catching up and would soon surpass them in global importance. He made remarks to the military that mainly went unreported by the media, saying that the West would never give up on its attempts to undermine China's rise to prominence and overthrow the Communist Party. 2 months after he visited the U.S., he informed top commanders in November 2015, "The most important factor driving a profound readjustment of the international order is our country's growing strength. Some Western nations fervently hope that a socialist China led by the Chinese Communist Party never becomes powerful. We've seized the opportunity, eliminated intervention and sped up construction on South China Sea islands and shoals, achieving a historic breakthrough in maritime strategy and defending maritime rights." Xi's statements may be found in his compilation of lectures to Communist Party and People's Liberation Army officials. The military released the speeches for top commanders to review internally, and the New York Times saw and verified them. The books titled Xi Jinping Selected Major Statements on National Defense and Military Development span the first several years of his administration, from February 2016 to December 2012. The speeches present a fresh, unbiased look at the leader at the heart of the superpower competition reshaping the 21st century. They demonstrate how, on occasion, he has expressed an almost fatalistic belief that Beijing's ascent will provoke a counterattack from Western competitors looking to preserve their domination, even before Beijing's relations with Washington soured significantly later in the Trump administration. In 2014, Xi advised Chinese Air Force officers, "The faster we develop, the bigger the external shock will be and the greater the strategic blowback." According to Xi, the West has worked to weaken the Chinese Communist Party's hold on domestic authority and limit its influence overseas. In response to these challenges, the Communist Party had to impose strict regulations and build up the People's Liberation Army. Uncertainty surrounds the relationship as Xi prepares to meet with President Joe Biden this week in California. How will the two powers handle their rivalry? Seemingly under pressure from China's economic woes and a desire to lessen Beijing's diplomatic isolation, Xi has been working to restore relations with Washington. Xi recently told U.S. lawmakers in Beijing, "We have 1,000 reasons to grow the relationship between China and the United States, and none at all to ruin it. But with mutual distrust running deep, any easing of antagonism between the two sides could be tenuous." In a rare instance of public honesty, Xi stated in March that Western countries led by the United States have implemented all-around containment, encirclement and suppression of China, reiterating his assessment of the challenge posed by the U.S. Uncertainty about American power. The unrest in China shaped Xi's perspectives on the world and the U.S. during the years leading up to his ascension. China had experienced rapid growth, but official corruption was pervasive, and the reforms that had spurred that progress had halted. The security state had grown, but opposition and protest had too. Some scholars, diplomats, and well-connected Communist Party veterans believe that when Xi emerged in 2007 as the country's leader-in-waiting, he would be a pragmatist who may revive China's moves toward economic liberalization. After a protracted period of inaction, some even saw the possibility of political transformation in him. They pointed to Xi's lineage as the son of a revolutionary leader who had assisted in managing China's economic reform in the 1980s, as well as the decades he had served as an official in the eastern Chinese provinces known for their commerce, including 17 years in Fujian where he courted Taiwanese investors. Retired senior official Li Rui, who had previously assisted Mao Zedong, wrote in his notebook about a 2007 discussion regarding the relatively unknown Xi. I stated, I asked Xi Jinping what he was like, and he gave me 4 words: governing by doing nothing. Li continued, letting everyone play to their strengths with less meddling would be good. Li passed away in 2019. Stanford University's Hoover Institution is the custodian of his diaries and correspondence. However, Xi's childhood and familial history had a more nuanced influence than most people realized because he was primarily proud of the party and the Communist Revolution. As Xi got ready to assume leadership, doubts about American might and caution about its intentions toward China spread throughout Beijing. Even while Beijing disagreed, official Chinese beliefs that Washington's economic leaders were capable were upended entirely by the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. Chinese authorities questioned U.S. officials, including the Treasury Secretary at the time, Hank P., about their mishandling of the situation. The lessons in Beijing did not end with the financial system for many. Desmond Shum, a businessman whose memoir Red Roulette details those years when he mixed with China's political elite, called it a defining moment. The Western model was called into much greater question after it. There was also a developing notion that China must lead the globe out of its predicament. The Color Revolution ghost. President Vladimir Putin of Russia was beginning to emerge as a prototype of an authoritarian strongman retaliating against American dominance, just as Xi was getting ready to take over as leader of China. According to Jude Blanchette, a China specialist at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, these two men have a shared mental map of the world, not the same, but shared. Both have a shared sense of the trauma of the Soviet Union's collapse, both want to restore their countries to a lost inheritance of greatness, both want to reclaim key territories. Xi and Putin, in particular, who first met in 2010, had a fear that the U.S. was determined to topple its adversaries by inciting uprisings in the name of democracy. Xi and other Chinese officials began referring to these disturbances as color revolutions, a term coined by Putin. Official Chinese fears of an upsurge in anti-party protests did not appear implausible in the mid-2000s. Public scandals and blatant corruption have angered a lot of people. Leaders of the Chinese Communist Party have always used a plethora of foreign threats to garner support. Since the Mao era, there have been suspicions of an American plot to topple the party and convert China to capitalism through peaceful evolution. However, Xi has issued those cautions with an unmistakable urgency. Xi's father taught him about the erratic nature of human relationships and power, which he carried throughout his life. This was revealed by Joseph Torregian, a research scholar at Stanford University's Hoover History Lab who has studied Xi's addresses to the armed forces. As the designated heir, he sees color revolutions and U.S. intervention around the globe. He concludes that power is ultimately the last line of defense for safety and strength. The Arab Spring upheavals that had overthrown corrupt authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East were a source of inspiration for Xi. John K. Culver, a former CIA official who tracked Xi's ascent, said that the 2011 removal of Egypt's leader, Hosni Mubarak, had a profound effect on Chinese leaders, who drew comparisons with the 1989 pro-democracy demonstrations at Tiananmen Square in Beijing. According to Culver, Hosni Mubarak climbed to the rank of officer in the Egyptian military, but the army turned against him, which alarmed them. He said that when Chinese authorities saw that, they asked themselves, would the army again save the party if Tiananmen Square happened today? The military reform of Xi. Soon after assuming office in late 2012, Xi met with government representatives and issued a dire warning, stating that China should learn from the disintegration of the Soviet Union. He regretted that it had collapsed due to the military's lack of bravery. He forewarned officials that unless the party regained its ideological core, China may experience the same destiny. A few months later, he issued an internal directive to reduce the impact of notions he perceived as Western, like the rule of law and universal human rights, in academic institutions and the media. Ben Rhodes, a former deputy national security advisor to Obama, claims that since Xi's first presidential summit with Obama in 2013, he has demonstrated a much more assertive and confident leader than Hu Jintao, putting aside his talking points to urge his views. In an email, Rhodes wrote, "This was a guy who was not just the frontman of a party, he was his own man." As the head of the Central Military Commission, Xi led the armed forces and saved some of his harshest criticism of the West for his generals. Hosni Mubarak climbed to the rank of officer in the Egyptian military, but the military turned against him, which is what really alarmed them, according to Culver. He said that when Chinese authorities saw that, they asked themselves, would the army again save the party if Tiananmen Square happened today? Beijing was forewarned, he added, by the pro-Western riots that were then sweeping across Ukraine. He claimed that certain Western nations were intentionally stoking the conflict and plotting to advance their geopolitical objectives there. We need to remember this lesson. Xi remarked that China had to restructure its armed forces to prepare for future threats radically. He started a massive reform of the People's Liberation Army in late 2015 to transform it into an integrated workforce that could project Chinese might overseas, mainly through air, sea, and space forces. His cautions on the West served to highlight how urgent those adjustments were. Beijing was forewarned, he added, by the pro-Western riots that were then sweeping across Ukraine. He claimed that certain Western nations were intentionally stoking the conflict and plotting to advance their geopolitical objectives there. We need to remember this lesson. According to Xi, the People's Liberation Army is still dangerously regressive and could regress if it does not actively pursue innovation, especially in modernizing its armaments and command structure. Xi refrained from stating in his speeches that conflict was inevitable. However, he made it apparent that China could not exercise its will without a strong military. In November 2015, he informed the commanders of the Central Military Commission, "In international contestation, political operations are critical, but ultimately, it comes down to whether you have strength and whether you can use that strength. It won't work to rely on a silver tongue,